learners once again to the next lecture of unit 4 of BP 103T, that is types of bases and how do we prepare bases, how do we prepare suppositories. So, in the last 2 lectures we saw what are suppositories, what are the advantages of suppositories, disadvantages of suppositories, this different shapes and sizes of suppositories, and what are the types of bases, because base forms the major chunk of the suppository. So, let us understand the what are the third type of bases. So, in the last 2 lectures we saw what are bases. Bases are nothing but these are the types of substances that on which suppositories are actually incorporated, the medication, the medicaments are actually inserted into them and they are actually responsible for making the suppositories rigid and firm. So, in the last lecture we saw 2 important types of bases, that is oily bases, and in the next lecture, in the another thing that we saw was water miscible bases, So, each and every type of bases had its advantages, had its disadvantages. We went through all these things. The last type of base that was left for this lecture is nothing but your emulsifying or synthetic base. Now, depending upon what kind of medicament you are incorporating into the medication, into the dosage form, the type of choice of bases will definitely going to vary. So, the emulsifying base or the synthetic base are of majorly 3 types. It is named as vitipsol, masa-asterinium and masupol. So, these are 3 important different types of bases that are classified under emulsifying bases or synthetic bases. Now, understanding vitipsol. Vitipsol are nothing but they are triglycerides and they are solid at room temperature. They also have a melting point of 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. Major advantages of using vitipsol is that they do not become rancid, they have good integrity when they are incorporated with medicaments of both the origins, or if the medications is amphiphile in nature, then vitipsol is definitely used. Then moving on to masa-asterinium. Masa-asterinium is not a triglyceride, but it is a monoglyceride and biglyceride. So, it is also firm and it has a good integrity at room temperature, and it is majorly used when the production of suppositories are to be done on a larger scale, because using cocoa butter is definitely expensive, and if we are going for water miscible bases, it has a tendency to become rancid. It is very much hygroscopic. Then if we are using theobroma oil, it is going to produce laxative action. So, it is definitely not suitable for patients who are going through diarrhea conditions. So, definitely in such cases our synthetic bases or the emulsifying bases plays a very important and vital role. So, now moving on to masupol. Masupol is another triglyceride of the class emulsifying or synthetic base, and it is oftenly chosen when we want the suppositories to have a flexible shape or size and we want a pleasant appearance suppository. So, in that cases also we go for masupol as an emulsifying or synthetic basis. So, when we compare emulsifying base or synthetic base from the prior 2 bases that we had used, that is nothing but your oily bases and water miscible bases, what we see that synthetic base or the emulsifying base have major acceptability by patients, because they are oftenly firm, they are very rigid, they maintain their integrity, and they are actually not that expensive as compared to the cocoa butter thing, and storing of the suppositories which is made by using these kind of bases is also never an issue, because they do not become rancid very easily. Then they do not have the tendency to stick to the mold. So, in that cases also we get a suppository which is of pleasant appearance, and eventually what we have is we see that when we are supposed to manufacture anything, then by using semi-synthetic basis or the emulsifying agent, is definitely has got its good shelf life, higher acceptability, compliance by patient. So, definitely semi-synthetic or the emulsifying base is definitely a yes for the major manufacturers firms. Moving on to the next slide, let us understand what are the advantages and disadvantages of emulsifying bases. First, they solidify rapidly. So, definitely this is the advantage, because if they do not solidify rapidly, then they are not going to remain firm or integral. As a result, their solidity plays a very important role. So, it becomes very important that they solidify rapidly. So, making of suppositories is never a major concern when our base is of good solidity or firmness. Then moving on towards the another advantage is that lubrication of mold is not required. So, here I would like to tell everyone that whenever we are making suppositories and we are incorporating that liquid suppositories into a mold in order to form a particular shape, then it becomes very important that lubrication of mold is done. If lubrication of mold is not done, then what is the major issue that will happen is that sticking of suppositories is going to occur, and we do not require suppositories to stick to our mold, because if the suppositories will stick to the mold, then removal of suppositories is going to be very problematic. And during removal, if there is a sticking of the suppository happens, the unaesthetic appearance may always accompany the suppository, which is completely unacceptable by any patient, because aesthetic appearance plays a very important role in increasing the compliance of any particular medication. So, here the major disadvantage, major advantage is that lubrication is never a hindrance. Lubrication is not required, because itself it is not going to stick to the mold. So, here lubrication is never required. Less liable to get rancid, definitely, which was a major concern when we were using theobromo oil. They were always susceptible to rancidity, foul smell, unacceptable odor. Here such is not the case when we are using emulsifying bases. So, it does not become rancid, it never has a foul smell, it never goes through any sort of deterioration or disintegration, it does not happens. Last advantage of emulsifying base is that it is non-irritant. So, this is of major prime importance, because if a patient is on a suppository therapy for a longer period of time, what is the major thing is that if the bases are irritant, then the patient will develop bronchitis, as we have discussed in the first lecture, or the mucosal lining of that particular organ is going to be affected, which is a completely undesirable for a patient as well as for a medical professional. So, here the major advantage of emulsifying base is that it is completely non-irritant. So, if a patient is continuously exposed to a suppository therapy for a longer period of time, there will not be any sort of irritation, that there will not be any sort of inflammation of any particular tissue which is being completely exposed or which is being continuously supplied by suppositories. Then these are some of the advantages. Let us understand the disadvantages of suppository. The very first disadvantages of suppository is that it becomes brittle when cooled in a refrigerator. Yes, here is the various important disadvantage. Among that, the very first disadvantage is that the suppository, if it is cooled rapidly, it is not going to remain firm, or it is not going to remain solid. It becomes, in fact, it becomes brittle, and brittle is never choice of acceptability, because as you take the suppository and if it becomes brittle, the complete idea of incorporating it into the body orifices is completely taken down, because the brittleness of suppository is never a acceptability for manufacturers, for patients, or for medical professionals. So, we have to be very careful when we are using emulsifying bases. The cooling or the rapid cooling of suppositories must not be done when we are using emulsifying bases, because whenever these base goes into the refrigerator and if they are cooled rapidly, they have the tendency to become brittle. So, rapid cooling must be avoided when we are using emulsifying bases. Another disadvantage is that it is not very viscous. So, here is definitely viscosity is a major hindrance when we are using emulsifying bases. Now, due to viscosity issues, medicament incorporated with base settle downs. Yes, here is a major disadvantages that whenever we are using emulsifying bases in order to make suppository, the bases that we are taking, that is the emulsifying base, has the tendency to become less viscous, or it becomes more liquidy. As a result, what happens is the medicaments is going to settle at the bottom of the suppository. For example, if this is the if this is the suppository and if we are incorporating emulsifying bases as our base, and if we have certain sort of API in it, and if we are having any kind of API in it, and if this emulsifying base is less viscous, it is not that viscous, it is not very much viscous, what is going to happen is our medication or the API is going to remain at the bottom part of the suppository. So, what happened? Initially this part is going to get melted. So, this part will reach the blood circulation. So, no effect is going to be seen because this part does not contain API. Now, the last part of the suppository is going to contain API in it. However, we know that the major disadvantage of suppositories is that it is going to leak out of the body as well. Certain amount definitely gets leaked out from the orifices. So, what may happen is that all the part that is going to get leaked out from the orifices is nothing but that part that contains major chunk of the API. So, it becomes very important that while using emulsifying bases, if we are using emulsifying bases, the viscosity is of major hindrance. So, these are nothing but some of the advantages and disadvantages of emulsifying bases. Let us have a quick revision of it. Emulsifying bases solidify rapidly, which is very important and very boon for us. Then lubrication is not required, definitely, as I said now, that if lubrication is not done and if the bases stick to the mold, what may happen is that unaesthetic or unappealing appearance of suppositories may happen, which is completely unacceptable by the manufacturer, by the firm or by the patient as well. Then rancidity does not happens when we are using emulsifying agent as an base of the suppository. So, if rancidity does not takes place, the shelf life of the product is going to be enlarged. So, the storage condition of the shelf life or the expiry of the product is actually enlarged, and thus it is actually a very important thing for the manufacturer, for the patient as well. Then it is non-irritant. So, if it is non-irritant, it is not going to cause any harm to the patients. Then understanding the disadvantages, if it is rapidly cooled, it is going to get brittle, then it is not very viscous. So, due to viscosity issues, there are problems that the medication is not going to enter into the bloodstream and no biological action is being evoked into the patient. If no biological action is being invoked into the patient, what may happen is less biological activity or no biological activity is seen, and thus the patient is not going to get any advantage if we are using suppositories. Moving on towards the next slide, we had just now understood what are the bases, the types of bases, and understanding each and every types of bases. Now, let us understand how are we supposed to prepare suppositories. It might feel that preparation of suppositories is very easy. However, there are various certain steps that are needed to be understood, that are needed to be followed while making suppositories. So, majorly if we try to understand the preparation of suppository, majorly it is being classified into three important types. The first is your hand rolling method, the second is your fusion method, and the third and important method of preparation is the cold compression method. Understanding the first method, hand rolling method. So, hand rolling method is nothing but it is a method that has been used traditionally by people when there was a lack of sophisticated instruments. So, everything was done by their hands by using hygienic conditions and everything. We are going to have a detailed look into the hand rolling method. Fusion method is the method that we as a student, we as a teacher do on a lab scale, and that is nothing but the fusion method. And last is the cold compression method. Cold compression method is a method that are being employed while making suppositories on a larger scale, on a firm or on a big manufacturers. When we want to produce 100 or lakhs of suppositories, we do not go for hand rolling method, or we do not go for fusion method. We often choose the cold compression method. So, now let us understand these methods in a more deeper way. So, first is the hand rolling method. Hand rolling method, as we can see the images, we can see that the rolling of suppositories is done by using the proper sanitized or cleaned hands. So, let us understand, It is the most oldest and simplest method of suppository preparation. Yes, as I have just now discussed that initially there were no sophisticated instruments and there were no various machineries that were employed in making suppositories. Hence, initially traditionally this was a method that was practiced by various manufacturers and by various individuals. So, this method is not very complicated, not very tedious. It is the most simplest and and very much cheap method, because it does not require the use of any of the sophisticated or expensive machines. Now, let us understand what happens here is, what we do is we take the base. The base can be anything. It can be emulsified butter, it can be coca butter, it can be theobroma oil, it can be emulsifying agents, it can be water miscible bases as well. So, depending upon the choice, depending upon the need of an individual, we can choose the bases, and in this base what we are going to do is we are going to incorporate our API. API is nothing but our medication. If we are going to manufacture a suppository or to produce a suppository which is antibacterial in nature, so here in such cases our API is going to be antibacterial. So, when we are incorporating base and API, what is the next step that we are going to do? It is nothing but we are going to triturate the grated coca butter and active ingredient in a mortar. So, mortar pestle is the signature of a pharmacist. So, in the mortar what we are going to do is we are going to take the base, then we are going to incorporate the API in it, and slowly and gradual trituration of this entire mass is done here. Then as this stage is reached, as we can see, a dough or a mass like stage is reached, and when this stage is reached, what we do is we take the help of clean and sanitized hand and we roll these substances on a plain surface. While rolling, we have to be extra cautious that no dust particles or unwanted material do not stick to this mass, because if sticking of any unwanted material occurs at this stage, what happens here is our suppository will be of unaesthetic appearance, will not be of good quality, or will not have a good appealing appearance. So, which is a very important thing to be noticed here. So, here what happens when you get a long mass of that particular suppository, according to the need of the shape and size, they are often cut into the desired shape and size. For example, if we want to make rectal suppositories out of these kind of hand rolling method, we will cut into a shape and we will make the shape of like this, because this is the shape often used for insertion into the rectal cavity. For example, if we are going to make vaginal suppositories oftenly called as pessaries, then we will cut this mass into this disc size shape or such kind of shapes, because in such cases the insertion becomes more easily and compatible. So, depending upon the choice of insertion, depending upon the choice of cavity you have selected, depending upon the type of diseases that you are treating, the cutting and the shaping, resizing of the suppositories can also happen. So, this is a diagrammatic representation of hand rolling method. Hand rolling method is the most old and traditional method which was used to prepare suppository. This method does not it's not in much practice nowadays, because as you know that we have so many sophisticated instruments and machineries all over the world now. So, such methods are oftenly eliminated, or you may not find such kind of methods, because in such cases the major disadvantages is that incorporation of dirt occurs, or incorporation of any of the resident bacteria or any sort of microbes which is present in our hand might occur, it might take place. So, this plays a very important role, and this thing has to be kept in mind. So, you may not find this method to be used nowadays very frequently. Moving on to the next slide, hand rolling method. Let us understand this method in a more deeper way. Here, as I have discussed, the mass is rolled into a ball in the palm of the hands, then rolled into a uniform cylinder with a large spatula or a small flat board. As I have discussed in my previous slide, what you do is initially you triturate the mass on a mortar. And after the trituration, what you do is you prepare a mass, you prepare a dough, you prepare a mass, and out of that mass you take that mass into a flat board or into a cylindrical board. After then, this cylinder is cut into an appropriate number of pieces which are rolled onto one end to produce a conical shape. When you put the cylindrical mass into a flat board, depending upon our choice, depending upon our desire, depending upon our necessity, we are going to cut the cylinder into any shape. Just now I have discussed, if you want to insert into the rectum, the shape of the suppository is going to vary like that, is going to vary accordingly. If you want to insert it into any sort of conical shape or into a disc shape, then the shape is going to vary as per our requirements. Then effective hand rolling method requires considerable practice and skill. So definitely if we want to go for hand rolling method, we need a huge amount of skill, practice, all such kind of things are definitely needed. As a result, this method is something related to tradition, related to old things, and this method is not at all practiced nowadays. Moving on to the fusion method. Fusion method is nothing but it is the method that we as a teacher and students practice on a smaller scale, on a lab scale. Here, first of all, what we do is we melt the suppository bases. Whatever base we are using, we are going to melt that base initially. Then any sort of incorporating the drug into the melting base. Whichever base you are desiring or whichever suppository you want to manufacture, you are going to incorporate that suppository into that base. Then what you have is, you have a mortar pestle, you have incorporated initially the base, and that base should be melted, plus what you have added is, you have added the API into it. Another thing is that this mixture is removed from the heat. You heat it because everything that you have is a melted thing. Initially you have melted it, everything. Then what you do, you stop or you remove the heat from it. After removal, what you do is you allow the melt to congeal. Congeal is nothing but you allow it to actually cool down, congeal, to cool and solidify. What you do is to cool and solidify your melted mass. Then what you do is you remove the formed suppositories from the mold. Then after the congealing happens, what you do is you remove your medicament, you remove everything from your mold. But removal requires highly skilled behavior, because if you do not remove this from the mold carefully, our suppository is going to stick to the mold, which is not at all desirable. Then the fusion method can be used with all types of suppository and must be with most of them. So definitely fusion method is one of the most acceptable method while making suppository, because this method is not very difficult, is not very tedious, and it can be done very easily on a lab scale, even by a learner as well. So here it is very simple. You take a vessel, you incorporate the liquid or melted base into it, and when the bases are liquefied or they are melted, what you do is you add the medication or the API into it. After medication, what you do, you mix them both very carefully, and once mixing is done, what you do is you pour them into a mold. So these are nothing but these are the mold that have been made, and once they are properly poured into a belt, we allow them to solidify, we allow them to congeal. So congealing is a major step here. Once they are properly cooled and congealed, what we do is we remove the suppository from the mold carefully. Moving on to the next slide. So this is a diagrammatic representation of how fusion method takes place. Initially what we are doing is, we are actually incorporating this melted thing into a mold. So this is nothing but this is the mold. So we are incorporating our entire melted mass into this mold. Next step is that what? We actually make sure that extra thing is being cut off, because we do not want our suppository, one or the other suppositories to be of different sizes. We want equal sizes of all the suppository. So extra thing is being cut out by here, as you all can see very carefully. Next thing is that we very carefully remove it from the mold. Here removal of suppositories is very important and it has to be done very carefully, because if we do not remove them carefully, sticking occurs, and discussing it many more times that sticking is completely a no process when we are making suppositories. Lastly, this is nothing but our finished and a good appearance suppository. This is what we desire. Moving ahead, cold compression method. Cold compression method is the method that has been employed apart from your hand rolling method and fusion method. Cold compression method is a method that is being completely used by all the large firms, the manufacturers, and as you can see, this word cold is present here. So no heating or excessive heating is required here. So let us understand, cold compression molding is a melted method. It is a method in which from an entire mixed mass or grated suppository base and medicament. Initially what we do, this is how the entire apparatus of cold compression method looks like. What we do, we put the prepared mass in it, and that mass has an addition of base and API in it, and that mass must be grated, that it must be reduced to a particular size. Then what we do is the suppository base and the other ingredients are combined by thorough mixing. Definitely homogenization and mixing must be done so that the base is able to incorporate entire amount of medicament into it. Now, the friction of the process causes the base to soften in a paste like consistency. Here we do not use heat, we are not at all using heat. Basically, when we are triturating or when we are mixing the medication and the bases, there is a slight generation of heat, and due to this heat generation only there is a complete mixing occurs, there is a soft paste like consistency takes place. So, no heating is happening in this process, which is very important, because in this process when we are completely refraining ourselves from using heat. So, this method is also very much favorable by thermolabile drugs. Any drugs which cannot tolerate heat can also be made into suppository when we are going for cold compression method. So, cold compression method on small scale, if we want to do cold compression method, definitely a mortar and pestle can be used in order to triturate or in order to make a small dough of the particular mass. If we are using or making into a larger scale, what we do, instead of using mortar and pestle, what we do, we use mixers which has got kneading plates or which has got baffles, which will ensure proper and homogeneous mixing of the proper ingredients. Now, in this machine, the suppository mass is placed into a cylinder which is closed. There is a cylindrical vessel into which we completely fill our mass of the suppository. Pressure is applied from one end and the mass is released from the one end into the suppository mold or die. So, at one end what you do is you keep on applying the pressure from one end, and on the other end the suppositories are often removed from the another end into a particular shape or into a particular size which you have already fixed. So, this is a very simple and at the same time very important method used by each and every firms. So, this was all about your manufacturing of suppositories, be it your fusion method which is completely used on a lab scale, be it your hand rolling method which was made initially by, or it is a traditional method which is completely eradicated from today's era, or the cold compression method which is completely being used by large scale manufacturers. So, I hope you all must have understood what are the different methods of preparation of suppository. So, next lecture of we are going to study about the another types and calculation. So, thank you so much for this lecture.